hours ahead are yours, that then is conducive to work.
So often we hear about writers developing superstitions about their work, or a kind of a personal mythology that means, you know, certain things have to be in place for them to be able to access the muse, but it sounds like you've been able to resist that.
I think your enemy as a writer is always laziness, is always the idea that if only conditions were right, you could write another chapter. And you're always making sure conditions are not right, so you can do anything other than work. And I think you've got to really stop fooling yourself. If you need to write a book, write it now. What are you doing now? Not what are you doing tomorrow. What are you doing now?
It is interesting, however, to discover that writing for Colm often might happen when he is busy doing other things.
I'm working on a book at the moment, but really part of the work comes, it's in a very strange way, where you're walking along the street or lying in bed. And I remember the other day, I have a problem with a character where I want to give him enough motive for what he's doing, and works out that even though he knows it's wrong, he's going to go on doing it, at least for the moment. And a solution came into my head just for no reason, out of the blue. I didn't even need to write it down. It seemed so right. And it could dissolve later, but it probably won't. But that is the lovely business of feeling that you're working as you're walking along the street. And I mean, sometimes my partner says to me, what are you thinking about? And I said, don't ask. I'm thinking about my book. He sort of sighs, oh, it's the book again. I said, yes, the book again.
And the novel in question is one that will be hotly anticipated. Now I hear that you're writing the sequel to Brooklyn, which people will be very excited about.
I promised I wouldn't. I hate sequels. I mean, I love Godfather 2, but if your sequel is not Godfather 2, don't write it, you know? In other words, I promised I wouldn't do it. I absolutely intended not to do it. And then a while ago, again walking along the street or lying around, I got an image, I saw something, and it was the beginning of a novel. Not a sequel as much as the beginning of a whole new story, but with all those characters. So yeah, you've got to make sure that there's actually something that gives the book a sort of a need to be.
So now that Colm is in the throes of it, what are the mechanics of the writing process? It turns out, for him, these are similar to composing a piece of music.
I think with the novel, you have to remember that the inspiration you need only come once. In other words, that you have an idea, or an image, or a configuration, or some sense of something, and that eventually moves into melody, becomes rhythm, becomes a sentence rather than an idea. I mean, an absolutely clear sentence that can come to you out of the blue when you least expect it, and your job is to write that down. And then what you need to do is to start working on the next page, on the page after that. So you have about 3 pages. What you need to do then is to go over those pages morning, noon, and night. I work in longhand, so what I would do would be I'd write those 3 pages in longhand, I would type them up, then I would start tinkering with them.
And has that always been your process, or has it evolved over time?
I went, 20 years ago now, in New York, into the Metropolitan Opera to rehearsals of an opera. It was James Levine, the great conductor, and what he was doing was he was getting the orchestra to do the very opening of what he wanted, over and over and over. I was hoping he would go into the middle of it or something, but each time it would be now. And he was getting a crisp sound, he was getting what he wanted, he was getting everything together over and over and over. And it struck me, I started to do this. I'm really susceptible to any suggestion like that. I started to do this with openings of chapters. And you're working in longhand, so you write it to the opening paragraph. What you do then is you do the opening paragraph again, you write it out in full again. You don't correct it, raise it, or make marks on it. Leave it the way it is, and you write it out again. I think it's especially true for me with the opening of short stories, where if I can get the opening paragraph right, I can work.
Because I'm sure that it's impossible to live with a bum note in that melody if you force yourself to write it out a second time, a third time.
And what you need to do then, you need to say, I need to do a certain number of pages or words per day, and I need to order my day so that I can do the work. The problem when halfway through a novel is that you know the rest of the story by that time, and you realize, and you wonder, well, why do I need to finish this since I know it? And the answer is really simple. It is that this is a form of communication. It is not a form of self-exploration or self-expression. It is some fundamental, mysterious thing that maybe a singer has, where they want other people to hear their song, where, you know, a painter wants people to see the work. Similarly with a novel, it's written for the reader. That communicative connection is the vital energy that keeps you going. You know, you're not just working with characters in a novel. You're working also with an imaginary reader, and you're always judging how much the reader needs to know. Are you over-informing the reader? Are you surprising the reader? Are the rhythms strong enough to keep the reader's attention? But the main thing you have to do, the main thing and the only thing, is finish the book. Finish the book, finish the book. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, stop feeling sorry for yourself.
And it takes such a particular drive to persevere with a project that has such delayed gratification in that way. As you say, what do you think drives you to keep pursuing it?
I come from a background in Ireland where a lot of people who came before me in my family didn't get the chances that I got. While my father went to university, my mother emphatically didn't. She left school at 14, and she loved books, and I think would love to have studied much more and learned much more. So I suppose that's certainly one thing. But another thing is that I've learned, because I play tennis, that I'm competitive, and that I'm interested in that business of finishing the thing and trying to make it good, and that I'm driven in that sort of way. What happens with a novel is that it becomes a sort of crisis, in that, look, why is this novel not finished? And then you go into crisis mode, and you say, you know, I have to get up earlier in the morning, I have to complete a number of pages per day, and you can do this for maybe a month. Very intense work. When I'm really working, I work all day from 9 in the morning through to the time I go to bed at night. And, you know, I know this is going to be only a short and intense period. You couldn't live like that, I don't think. But you could do it for a month. And in that month, you get a lot of work done. It doesn't mean you don't revise it later. You know, it isn't as though this is an exciting process. It's slow, it's deliberate, and it's sentence by sentence. So, you know, it's not pleasure. I mean, I know what pleasure is. Pleasure is swimming in the Mediterranean in June, and it's not that. Once you establish a melody, and it could be a hidden rhythm that the reader mightn't necessarily notice, and it doesn't have to be a big opening or a big show-off opening. It could just be a simple sentence. But oddly enough, in that simple sentence could be buried something, a sound that you can really be like a key in music for the rest of the novel. I have a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, and I mean, I do remember walking back from the cinema in Dublin and it coming into my head and just trying to get home and write it down. And it is the first sentence of the novel. It doesn't seem like much, but it was the key to everything. And the sentence is this: Helen woke in the night to the sound of Manus whimpering. Manus is a child. Helen woke in the night to the sound of Manus whimpering.
She lay still and listened, hoping that he would quieten and turn on his side and sleep. But when his voice became louder and more insistent, and she could vaguely make out the words, she got out of bed and moved towards the boy's room. She was unsure whether he was dreaming or awake.
How does the fact that you're writing in longhand influence this, do you think?
The handwriting came as an accident with that novel, The Blackwater Lightship, which I think is the fourth novel I wrote. I was in Spain and I hadn't been planning to write. And suddenly all these images came and I realized I actually need to do this. I was working at the time on a typewriter. I had no typewriter with me. So I went and bought a big notebook. I began to write in longhand. And I found this very satisfying. I wished I had been doing it from before. Couldn't think why I hadn't done this before. And I found this, the making of the letters almost gave me pleasure. The sort of being able to almost touch the ink thing. I mean, I don't fetishize it. It isn't as though I buy a moleskin notebook or I use a particular pen. I use whatever is to hand. And it does slow things down because what I find is that typing it then myself is crucial in that I get to live through it a second time to make each letter again. And that adds to my own engagement with it, my own immersion in it.
You're listening to In the Studio on the BBC World Service. In this edition, the Irish author Colm Tóibín is guiding us through his writing process. Colm tells me that after we speak, he's going to give himself a break from work to play tennis. But even that in itself can be a tool for becoming a better writer.
Years ago, I was doing a profile of the Spanish film director Pedro Almodóvar. And one day I came up with the idea that we should play a game of tennis. I learned more about him in that hour or 2 hours than I learned in all the interviews. He writes his own screenplays, which means he spends months in seclusion doing that. He writes them and rewrites them and rewrites them and perfects them. And I learned that there was a sort of determination, a sort of hardness in him, a sort of physical thing that wasn't necessarily stylish as much as solid. I'm much worse. I have no style whatsoever. I'll do anything to hit the ball back. There's a funny business of using instinct, of not thinking, of actually trying to release energy from yourself that isn't the thinking, deliberate, deciding part of you. It comes from a much more open space within you. And that's what running a lot in tennis is good for, that you're running so much, you haven't time to think, and you might actually hit a good shot for a change. And I think writing is like that too, that sometimes just stop thinking, stop planning, let it go for a second, see what will come.
Whether it's Spanish filmmakers or opera conductors, Colm has a particular interest in the working process of other artists. In acclaimed works of fiction, he has captured the lives of two of his own literary heroes on the page. Recently, his novel The Magician opened up the world of the German figure Thomas Mann, and in 2004's The Master, Colm imagined 5 years in the life of the turn-of-the-century American writer Henry James.
Henry James is interesting because he kept notebooks. And, for example, you take the story The Turn of the Screw, which I think is his most famous story, and you see he wrote it in 1897. But in 1895, in January, he comes home from dinner, always having dinner, James, with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury had told him the basis of that story. He notes it down in January 95. He doesn't write it for 2 more years. But so you can see then it festering, it's fermenting in his mind. And yes, you can see how, in a way, that's maybe how all novelists work.
He did not need to look back at his notebook to be reminded of the story. The events remained with him. He thought of setting it in Newport, in a remote house by the rocks, or in one of the newer mansions in New York, but none of these settings captured him. And gradually he abandoned the idea of an American family. It became an English story set in the past, and in the early and slow elaboration of the story, he reduced the children to merely 2, a boy and his younger sister.
In the case of Henry James, I chose 5 years, 1895 to 1900. These are particularly fallow years in his life, and so I'm working with his solitude, but also the novel is very much peopled by his past, and so it's a much more intense book than The Magician, which has a more, I mean, it's not exactly epic quality because I'm trying to keep the Thomas Mann story intimate. It is about it's not a novel about the First World War or the Second World War or the rise of Hitler. It's a novel about a very private, almost apolitical figure who happens to live through these years, which really sort of maim his life or certainly have a huge influence on how he lives because he has to go into exile. But I'm still working with the Thomas Mann book, with his creation. So I have the novel Buddenbrooks. I also have the information about his childhood as well. And so you can see how much of his